Imagine stepping into a decision that could fundamentally reshape your company's future. I mean, a moment where a family-run business born from this tiny electrical trading shop in a bustling deli market suddenly faces an opportunity to catapult itself onto the global stage or, risk everything.
It's a high-stakes scenario,
Yeah.
absolutely. And we're talking about an acquisition target that's not just bigger.
Right.
It was closer to 3 times their size by revenue, half a world away in Europe.
And the deadline, less than a week.
Yeah.
That's breathtakingly short.
Insanely short. So this isn't just about financial models and market share projections.
No, not at all. This is really about the very human side of these incredibly bold decisions, that tension between gut instinct and the hard numbers.
Exactly. And the frantic pace, speed versus long-term strategy. How do you even balance that?
That's the core of it. And this exact scenario played out for Havells India Limited back in November 2006.
It did. And at that exact moment, Havells was actually riding high. They were in the middle of a record-breaking year, projecting sales over 10 billion rupees.
Which was huge for them.
Huge. Headquartered in Delhi, they'd really cemented their place as a top manufacturer of essential electricals in India. Circuit breakers, switches, cables, the core stuff.
So just as they're hitting their stride domestically, this completely unexpected call comes through.
Right. From Rothschild, a major New York investment bank.
And they present this, unprecedented opportunity. Bid for Sylvania Lighting International, SLI, a giant in the lighting world based in Frankfurt, Germany.
And what made it so urgent, almost terrifyingly so, was that ticking clock you mentioned.
Yeah.
Rothschild wasn't just testing the waters. They were actively working on an exclusivity agreement with another bidder who wasn't named.
So the pressure was really on.
Immense pressure. Havells had literally days, less than a week, to figure out their plan, marshal resources, decide if they were even going to jump into this massive bidding war before the door just slammed shut.
A true test of agility and, frankly, nerve.
Absolutely. Nerve is the right word.
So for you, our listener, this deep dive today is going to explore much more than just the mechanics of an M&A deal.
Yeah, our mission really is to unpack the whole context.
Yeah.
The global electrical and lighting industries at that time, the market dynamics.
And crucially, those intense internal debates and discussions inside Havells that led them to even consider what was arguably one of their most daring moves ever, going global by acquiring Sylvania.
As we go through this story, we'll touch on some really fundamental questions, things that apply to almost any big decision, right?
How do you evaluate a deal that just seems way too big on paper?
Exactly. And what role does something like brand legacy play? Or access to distribution networks? And, maybe the trickiest part, cultural integration.
That's a huge one. And maybe the deepest question, can you truly go global, expand like that, without losing your core identity, your roots, the very thing that made you successful to begin with?
It's a fascinating journey, a real business case study brought to life. We're excited to explore with you.
Okay, so to really grasp just how audacious this Sylvania move was, we absolutely need to understand Havells itself, because they didn't start out as this global powerhouse, did they? Their origins were incredibly humble.
Oh, incredibly humble. The Havells story starts way back in 1958 with a company called Guptaji & Company, just a small trading business in central Delhi's Bhagirath Place.
Right, which is, for anyone who knows Delhi, a famously chaotic, crowded wholesale market for electrical goods, a real hive of activity.
Exactly. It was founded by Kimat Rai Gupta, often called QRG, or Guptaji. He was actually a former teacher from Punjab who'd moved to Delhi to work with his uncle.
A teacher turned entrepreneur.
Yeah. And despite the, tough economic climate back then, QRG had this inherent entrepreneurial drive that allowed his small business to grow steadily.
And there's a really pivotal moment very early on that truly showcases his unique foresight, something that went against the grain at the time, didn't it?
It really did. It shows his long-term thinking. In 1961, QRG did something quite unusual for that market. He took all his savings.
Which must have been a significant amount for him then.
A very significant sum, yes. And he used it to buy the brand name Havells from another local trader, a man named Haveli Ramgandhi.
Just the name, not the business.
Just the name. QRG later said Havells was already somewhat recognized by consumers, even though the owner was struggling. But his peers, the other traders, they didn't get it. They saw no value in owning a brand. Their focus was purely on buying and selling goods.
But QRG saw something different.
He saw the power of brand equity long before it was a buzzword. He believed it was the key to scaling up, to making it big in times to come, as he put it. He intuitively understood that a brand could build trust and loyalty.
That's incredible foresight for 1961 in that environment, a real turning point.
Absolutely. It shifted his focus from just trading to actually building something lasting, a legacy.
So he had this vision around the brand. And it wasn't just about trading for long, they soon formalized things and made that big shift into manufacturing.
Precisely. The company became Havells India Private Limited in 1983, then a public limited company in 1992. And this move from trading to making their own products was actually nudged along by government regulations in the mid-70s.
Ah, policy driving change.
Yeah, the Indian government was promoting domestic production, putting restrictions on imports. So it created an incentive for local businesses like Havells to build their own manufacturing capacity.
And QRG seized that opportunity.
He did. In 1976, they set up their first small plant in Nagar, Delhi, making basic rewirable switches. Then they quickly expanded high rupturing capacity, or HRC fuses, in '79 at Badli, Delhi.
Those are more heavy-duty circuit protectors, right?
Exactly. And by 1980, they were making high-quality energy meters in Nagar, Delhi. This really laid the foundation for their future product diversification. They were becoming a serious industrial player.
But even with this early vision and, aggressive expansion, it wasn't exactly smooth sailing. QRG himself said the growth did not come easy. What kind of challenges were they up against, especially as a family-run business?
He was quite candid about two major hurdles. Externally, just getting bank loans in India back then was incredibly tough.
Right. Capital was scarce.
Very scarce. Banks were hesitant to lend to smaller, growing businesses without massive collateral or connections. So every expansion, every new machine was a real struggle for funding. It took immense personal effort and guarantees from QRG.
And internally, you mentioned family dynamics.
Yes, that was perhaps even more taxing, according to him. His relatives were partners in the business, and they often didn't agree with his, quote, aggressive risk-taking approach.
Ah, the classic conflict in family firms. Caution versus ambition.
Exactly. He explicitly mentioned that managing those family relationships and conflicts took up a significant amount of his time and energy. It highlights how personal disagreements can feel so much heavier when business and family are intertwined.
But he pushed through.
He did. He emphasized that despite all that, he did not lose focus and kept moving forward. Remarkable determination.
Absolutely remarkable resilience. So moving into the 1980s, Havells really started building that domestic strength. What did that rapid expansion look like? Was it just organic growth or acquisitions too?
It was a mix. The 80s were about consolidation and strategic partnerships. They made some early acquisitions like Towers and Transformers Ltd., which was already making energy meters.
Okay, so that immediately boosted their meter business.
Right. And at the same time, they expanded their own plant in Badli to produce miniature circuit breakers, MCBs, those essential safety devices you find in every modern electrical panel.
And that involved international collaboration.
It did. They set up a joint venture with a German company, Geier. That was a crucial early step, bringing in advanced technology and manufacturing know-how from Germany. It really helped elevate their product quality. So it was about expanding both their product range and their industrial footprint within India.
And this period also marks the entry of the next generation, right? Anil Gupta, QRG's son, joins the company. How did his arrival impact things?
Yes, Anil joined as joint managing director in 1992. He brought a different background, an economics degree from Delhi, and then an MBA from Wake Forest University in the U.S.
So a more formal business education.
Right. But his integration wasn't just about applying MBA theory. It was a very deliberate immersion into the Havells way. Anil recalled spending a lot of time with his father, QRG, both at work and at home, just talking deeply about every aspect of the business.
Learning the ropes directly from the founder.
Exactly. He quickly realized his formal training was valuable, but he really needed to understand the specific nuances and culture of the business from QRG, the unwritten rules, the core philosophy.
And what was that core philosophy, that specific way to handle people that Anil learned and adopted? It seems so central to Havells.
Anil described his father's approach as profoundly empowering. It wasn't about top-down control. It was about taking them along and getting them to do the work. QRG believed in trusting his team, giving them ownership, motivating them.
More collaboration, less command and control.
Precisely. And Anil explicitly said he adopted that same philosophy. He saw it as the cornerstone of Havells' management style. It's his deep belief in people management, creating an environment where employees feel valued and empowered to contribute.
And that seems to have smoothed his transition.
It did. He was apparently welcomed enthusiastically by the managers. He made a point of visiting the plants, interacting directly with employees, really cementing that people-centric culture he'd learned from his father.
So Anil embraces and champions this unique culture. And shortly after he joins, Havells makes another big move to fuel growth, going public.
That's right. Within about a year of Anil joining, Havells listed on the Bombay Stock Exchange, the BSE.
Why then? Was it just about raising money?
It was partly about money, yes, but also strategic positioning. They saw it as a way to grow big, mimicking other successful Indian companies that were going public around that time. They knew they needed access to public capital to fund their ambitions.
And the reputation boost that comes with being listed.
Exactly. And they put that IPO capital to good use immediately. They invested heavily in setting up new, modern manufacturing plants in places like Sahibabad and Faridabad. They also acquired another existing plant in Alwar.
So, significant expansion of their manufacturing base.
Very significant, and it paid off. By 1997, Havells crossed 500 million rupees in annual sales. They were undeniably a major domestic player in India's electricals industry.
But the Indian market wasn't going to stay static, especially not in the mid-90s. Liberalization changed everything, didn't it? Bringing in a flood of new competition.
It absolutely did. Liberalization opened the floodgates. Suddenly, Havells was facing intense pressure from two sides.
A pincer movement, you could say.
Yeah. On one side, you had the big, well-respected multinational corporations, the MNCs, names like Siemens, Philips coming in with advanced tech and established global brands, competing at the premium end.
And on the other.
Low-cost imports, particularly from China, started flooding the market, hitting them hard on price at the lower end. It put Havells in a really tough spot, forcing them to adapt quickly or risk getting squeezed out completely.
So what was their strategic response? This must have been a critical period for them. How did they navigate that intense two-front competition?
Their response was smart and multi-pronged. Starting around 1996, they realized they needed to seriously upgrade their technology and broaden their product range beyond what they could develop purely in-house.
So more international collaboration.
Exactly. They formed a 50.50 joint venture with Electrium from the UK to create Crabtree India Ltd. That move got them into the high-end modular switches market, a segment they weren't really in before.
Okay, accessing a new premium segment.
Right. Then in '98, they strengthened their existing technical tie-up with Geier, their German partner for MCBs, to bring in even more advanced circuit breaker tech. And they formed another 50.50 JV, this time with DZG of Germany, creating TTL Ltd., which let them produce sophisticated energy meters.
So leveraging foreign expertise across key product lines, and that they also made acquisitions within India.
They did. They bought a controlling stake in Standard Electricals, another Indian company making MCBs and fuse switches, which expanded their market reach. And crucially, they took a 60% stake in Duke Arnix Electronics Ltd., or DAL.
What was special about DO?
DAL was a pioneer in electronic metering in India and had strong R&D. This gave Havells a significant technological advantage in the rapidly evolving meter segment.
And these acquired companies weren't just absorbed, were they? There was a bigger strategy.
No, they operated as standalone companies within the larger Havells group. Standard Electricals, TPL, DAL, Crabtree India. Together, they actually brought in nearly half of the group's total revenue.
So it was a complementary strategy. Havells India focused on its core, while the group offered a much wider range.
Exactly. It meant the Havells group could offer basically the entire spectrum, electronic and electromagnetic meters, plus a full suite of other electrical products. And it worked incredibly well. By the year 2000, the group hit 5 billion rupees in sales.
Wow, a tenfold increase in just a few years.
A massive jump. They cemented their position as India's largest maker of NCDs and current meters. And just as importantly, they'd built this really strong domestic distribution network, over 1,000 dealers across India. They were a force to be reckoned with at home.
Okay, so dominant domestically, but facing that intense competition you mentioned from MNCs and imports. It seems logical that they'd start looking outwards, beyond India. What did their first steps into exporting look like?
It really started out of necessity, as you say. That fierce domestic competition meant that just relying on the Indian market wasn't a guaranteed path for long-term growth. They needed new markets, new sources of sales volume.
So where did they look first?
Initially, they focused on regions like Africa and the Middle East, markets where there was demand for reliable electrical products, perhaps less saturated than Europe, and where maybe price point was a bit more sensitive.
And was this just opportunistic selling or more structured?
It became quite structured. They set up a dedicated international business division, the IBD, specifically to handle exports. This division ended up catering to over 45 countries across different continents: Europe, Middle East, Far East, Africa.
Quite a broad reach.
Yeah, and they backed it up by opening actual branch offices in key hubs like London, Dubai, and even Bangladesh to have people on the ground.
So they were serious about building an international presence. But exporting electricals, especially to developed markets like Europe, isn't just about sales. You need the right certifications, right? Quality standards are critical.
You've hit on a really crucial point. That was a major strategic investment for Havells. They quickly realized that getting all those local country-specific approvals, things like the IEC standards, the CE Mark for Europe, German GS standards, wasn't just red tape.
They were essentially barriers to entry.
Exactly. Non-tariff barriers. Getting these certifications was, and still is, a complex, expensive, and technically demanding process. It often requires product redesigns, rigorous testing, and certified labs.
A significant hurdle for any company trying to export.
A huge hurdle. But Havells made that investment. They understood that without those stamps of approval, their products, no matter how good, simply couldn't be sold in many lucrative markets, especially in Europe and parts of Asia.
So even if early exports weren't super profitable.
Right, they often weren't because of these added costs and different market pricing. But they provided essential sales volume, kept the factories running efficiently, and critically laid the groundwork. They were learning how to operate internationally.
And then came what the sources call a big breakthrough in their export journey, something that really validated all that groundwork.
It really was a game changer for their international business. In mid-2003, Havells landed two major European outsourcing deals. They started manufacturing MCBs and electric meters for established European companies under those companies' brands.
Ah, so OEM manufacturing.
Exactly. And these weren't small orders. These deals basically quadrupled Havells' export revenues practically overnight, jumping to 600 million rupees in the 2003-2004 financial year.
A fourfold increase.
Yeah, a massive leap. It was huge validation. It proved they could produce world-class products, meet stringent European standards, and deliver reliably on a large scale. It showed they could compete globally, at least on a manufacturing level.
But even with this manufacturing success, Anil Gupta had this key realization about brand equity. This sounds like it fundamentally shifted their thinking about international strategy.
It was a profound moment, a real strategic pivot. Anil noticed something crucial. While their products were being accepted in Europe for their quality, and big names like Electrium were successfully selling Havells-made goods under their own brands.
Havells itself was basically unknown.
Exactly. He said Havells did not have a brand equity outside India. They were a top-notch manufacturer behind the scenes, but invisible to the end consumer in the global marketplace.
And they realized that had limitations.
Big limitations. They understood that real global power, the kind that lets you command better prices, build customer loyalty, and achieve deep market penetration, wasn't just about making good stuff efficiently. It was about owning and building a recognized brand.
So the strategy shifted from just being a great manufacturer to needing their own brand presence internationally.
Precisely. This realization pushed them towards actively looking for established brands they could acquire in international markets, not just seeking more manufacturing contracts. It fundamentally changed their M&A focus.
And that makes targeting a company like Sylvania, with its century-old, globally recognized name, make perfect sense, even if it seemed huge.
It becomes almost the logical next step, doesn't it? Buying an established brand like Sylvania was seen as a potential shortcut to achieving that global recognition they now craved. It was a way to leapfrog years of trying to build the Havells brand from scratch overseas.
And the shift towards acquiring brands led them to their first, albeit smaller, international acquisition.
That's right. Their first real step into buying companies abroad was a measured one. In 2005, they acquired a company in Greece for about 10 million euros.
Relatively small compared to what came later.
Very small, yes. But strategically important. It gave them an immediate foothold in the southern and eastern European markets, which were seen as growth areas. And maybe more importantly, it brought with it some essential global quality certifications they needed, which helped streamline selling their products in other European countries too.
So a calculated first move, getting their feet wet in international M&A.
Exactly. It gave them valuable hands-on experience navigating the complexities of an overseas deal, even on a smaller scale.
Then came the Electrium experience. This sounds like it was a major disappointment at the time, a real shock, as Anil described it, but ultimately turned into invaluable preparation.
It absolutely was both of those things. Havells already had a relationship with Electrium, the UK wiring accessories leader. They had the Crabtree JV in India, and Havells was even making some products for Electrium to sell in the UK.
So it seems like a natural fit when Electrium went up for sale.
It felt perfect. Anil even said he was confident, thinking Electrium was the right size for an acquisition, as Havells' sales were about double Electrium's at that point. They put together a serious bid, leveraging those new relationships they'd built with bankers like Rothschild and Deutsche Bank.
But they were outbid.
They were. In January 2006, Siemens swooped in and acquired Electrium for around £100 million. Havells lost out by less than £10 million.
That must have stung. So close.
And Neil described it as a profound shock. He said everyone in the company was deeply dismayed. They'd invested a lot of effort and probably emotional energy into that bid.
But there was a silver lining, as you said. What did they learn from that loss?
The silver lining was huge in retrospect. Despite the disappointment, going through that entire process, what Anil called a massive exercise, was an incredible learning experience. It taught them firsthand the nitty-gritty of mobilizing funds internationally, how to negotiate complex cross-border deals under pressure.
And crucially, how to work effectively with those major international banks.
Exactly. Forging and strengthening relationships with Rothschild and Deutsche Bank during that high-pressure bid was invaluable. So even though they failed to acquire Electrium, the process itself was like a high-stakes, real-world training course in international M&A.
Preparing them, perhaps unknowingly, for the much bigger Sylvania challenge just around the corner.
Precisely. It ironically provided the exact skills, experience, and banking relationships they would desperately need just months later when the Sylvania opportunity landed on their desk.
So even coming off that shock, they didn't retreat. They kept looking for targets.
No, they were still actively looking. The Electrium experience solidified their strategy. They needed cost advantages, yes, but crucially, they needed brand premium in the global market. They knew true global presence required owning brands and distribution, not just being a manufacturer.
And it was in that specific mindset, fresh off the Electrium roller coaster, that the call about Sylvania came from Deutsche Bank.
Exactly. The timing was perfect in a way. The lessons from Electrium were fresh. The banking relationships were warm. They were arguably much better prepared, mentally and operationally, for this far larger and even more time-sensitive gamble.
Okay, now let's shift focus to the target itself. Sylvania Lighting International, SLI. This wasn't just any company. It was a storied global giant, right, with a history stretching back over a century. How did it all begin for Sylvania?
SLI Sylvania's roots go way back to 1901, and it started in a rather innovative, resourceful way in Middleton, Massachusetts, founded by Frank Poor and partners.
And their initial business wasn't making bulbs.
No, initially it was recycling burned-out light bulbs. They'd buy old bulbs, carefully cut off the glass tips, replace the filament inside, and then reseal them to sell again.
Wow, early circular economy thinking.
Kind of, yeah. It was clever and profitable and allowed them to grow. From that base, they quickly moved into manufacturing new bulbs and later even radio tubes. By 1924, they formally named the company Sylvania Products Company.
From recycling to manufacturing, that's quite the start. And then it went through several ownership changes that shaped its global path.
Indeed. Over the next few decades, it changed hands a few times before being acquired by GTE, which was a large technology conglomerate back then.
And that GTE ownership was key for global expansion.
Very key.
Yeah.
GTE had the resources and the international reach. They helped Sylvania really expand its footprint globally. In 1965, GTE set up its lighting division headquarters in Denver, which helped centralize and drive the development of a truly global lighting business under that well-known Sylvania brand. That was a period of major international growth for them.
Then Siemens enters the picture in the early 90s, which led to that brand split we talked about. That must have complicated things.
It definitely added complexity. In the early 90s, GTE was under pressure and started selling off non-core assets. They sold the lighting business to Siemens.
And Siemens already had its own big lighting business, Osram.
Exactly. So Siemens merged Sylvania with Osram, creating Osram Sylvania. But they decided on a split brand strategy. Use the Sylvania brand mainly in North America, where it was strong, and use the Osram brand pretty much everywhere else, where Osram was dominant.
Interesting strategy. So Osram Sylvania became a global powerhouse.
It did. Despite the complexities, the combined entity became the third largest lighting company in the world, right behind GE and Philips. So the Sylvania name itself carried this legacy of being a major global player, even with the brand split.
So the Sylvania brand had this rich history, but then came more changes, leading specifically to SLI BV, the entity Havells was looking at. How did that separate entity come about?
That was purely down to regulatory hurdles, antitrust concerns, basically. To get the Osram-Sylvania merger approved, Siemens was forced to sell off Sylvania's operations in Europe and Latin America.
Ah, divestiture due to competition rules.
Precisely. So those significant assets, manufacturing plants, distribution networks in Europe and Latin America, plus the crucial rights to use the Sylvania brand outside North America, were bought by a private equity firm owned by Citicorp.
Okay.
They incorporated these assets in July 1992 as Sylvania Lighting International BV SLI, based in the Netherlands, a privately held company.
And this new SLIBV started strongly.
Very strongly. By the end of 1996, just 4 years later, it was doing U.S. $600 million in annual sales across 30 countries outside North America. It had quickly become Europe's third largest lighting company again, with factories in 9 countries, a successful rebirth.
But then, after that strong start, SLI seems to hit a really rough patch. What went wrong when the entrepreneur Frank Ward bought it?
Yet this part of the story is a bit of a cautionary tale about M&A gone wrong. In 1997, Citicorp sold SLI to Frank Ward, who also ran Chicago Miniature Lamps, CML. He paid $165 million and merged operations under SLI, Inc.
Okay, another ownership change.
Right. But Ward's new management team then went on what the sources describe as a string of acquisitions that unfortunately did not work out as expected.
Poor integration. Bad choices.
It sounds like a mix. Perhaps they overpaid or couldn't integrate them effectively, or the strategic fit just wasn't there, combined with an economic downturn hitting demand and rising competition squeezing prices.
It led to serious trouble.
It led SLI to file for bankruptcy. A really dramatic and rapid decline for a company with such a long history. It just underscores the risk of poorly managed, rapid expansion, and the absolute necessity of effective post-acquisition integration.
A stark reminder. So a company with this incredible legacy ends up in bankruptcy. How did it start to climb out of that, and what was its exact state when Havells entered the picture in 2006?
The recovery began in March 2003. Frank Ward sold the bankrupt SLI Inc. to a consortium of private equity firms, DDJ, Cerebras, and JP Morgan. These guys specialize in turnarounds.
Right, the turnaround specialists step in.
Exactly. They pledged investment and brought in a new management team led by Paul Griswold. Starting in 2004, Griswold's team began a major restructuring.
What did that involve?
2 main things. First, rationalizing manufacturing. That means closing inefficient plants, consolidating production lines, investing in upgrades to cut costs, making the operations lean again.
And second,
aggressively trying to expand their geographic reach again, finding new markets and sales channels. So these efforts did stabilize SLI, but by 2006, it was still very much a company in mid-turnaround.
and crucially, needing money.
Critically needing a fresh injection of capital, not just to survive, but to actually invest, grow, and compete properly in that tough global lighting market. And it was this urgent need for cash, likely encouraged by their bankers who saw a sale as the best option, that made SLI available as an acquisition target. That's what created the opening for Havells.
Got it. So in 2006, as Havells is weighing this massive decision, what did SLI actually look like in the market? What products did they offer, and where were they strong geographically?
Even after all the turmoil, SLI in 2006 still had a surprisingly comprehensive product range, comparable to the big guys. Their revenue that year was $473 million.
And how did that break down by product type?
It was pretty well diversified. About a third came from fluorescent and compact fluorescent lamps, CFLs. Those were the energy-saving darlings back then. Another third was from architectural and industrial lighting systems, like for big buildings or factories.
Okay.
And the final third was split among the more traditional stuff. Incandescent bulbs, halogen lamps, and high-density discharge lamps, the kind used for streetlights or stadiums.
So a full portfolio, and they had other brands besides Sylvania.
They did. They also marketed other known brands like Zenith, Linolite, Claude, Concord, and Marlin. So they had a diverse brand strategy appealing to different market segments.
That's a solid product base. And geographically, did they still have that global footprint?
They did, remarkably so. They have 11 manufacturing plants across 5 countries, giving them production scale. And maybe most importantly for Havells, they had 22 sales and distribution centers, mostly across Europe, South America, and the Middle East.
That network sounds like a key asset.
A huge asset. It demonstrated this wide-reaching, established route to market, which, as we'll discuss, was probably the single biggest attraction for Havells. But despite all this,
I still needed that cash infusion.
urgently. The competitive pressures, the ongoing restructuring costs, management knew they needed fresh capital. And their bankers knew it too, pushing towards a sale. And that's precisely the moment Havells got the call.
Okay, so the stage is perfectly set. Havells, ambitious, strong at home, but needing global reach and brands. SLI Sylvania, a global giant with a great brand and network, but needing cash and a turnaround boost. Now we arrive at the crossroads, the moment Havells has to make this incredibly bold decision under insane pressure. Rothschild calls. What's an immediate gut reaction inside Havells senior management?
When the top team at Havells got together for that crucial board meeting, the sources say the initial reaction to Rothschild's invitation was very positive.
Not hesitant, despite the massive size difference.
Apparently not hesitant initially. It seems to reflect just how strong their international ambitions had become, especially after tasting the process with Electrium. They saw SLI not just as a target, but as a potentially transformative path to accelerate their global strategy.
Were there any immediate red flags or concerns raised about Sylvania itself? Maybe something about its past, even in India?
There was a minor point raised. Someone remembered Sylvania's past operations in India back in the 80s under a joint venture called Sylvania Laxman.
Ah, okay. A potential complication.
Potentially, but they checked it out quickly. Senior management made inquiries and confirmed that this old entity wasn't going to pose any significant legal or operational hurdles for a new acquisition.
So, pragmatic problem solving, they dealt with that quickly.
Yeah, it showed they could identify a potential issue, assess it rapidly, and move on, keeping focus on the main prize.
Okay, initial reaction positive, minor concerns addressed, but let's dig into the core strategic fit. Havells was mainly in electrical gear, SLI in lighting. How did they see the synergy? Where was the real overlap that made this make sense?
This is really the crux of the strategic rationale, and it's quite insightful. On the surface, yes, different core products. SLI doing lamps and fixtures, Havells doing circuit breakers, switches, cables, with only a small lighting business at the time.
Right, seemed quite distinct.
But the critical insight, the thing Havells management keyed in on almost immediately was this. Despite the different technologies, the electrical and lighting industries share common distribution and retailing channels.
Ah, that's the link, the route to market.
Exactly. That was the crucial strategic overlap.
So Sylvania's huge established network in Europe and elsewhere wasn't just valuable for selling light bulbs. It could become a highway for Havells' own electrical products, too. A massive shortcut to global distribution.
That was precisely the thinking, and arguably the biggest driver for the deal. Havells saw Sylvania's network as an unparalleled, ready-made channel to get their own electrical gear into developed markets.
Can you paint a picture of how that would work, the difference between developed and emerging market distribution?
Sure. Think about how these products are sold. You got big institutional buyers, wholesalers, and then retail. In developed markets like Europe or the U.S., massive retail chains, think Home Depot, Lowe's in the U.S., or equivalents in Europe, are huge sellers of lighting. But they also sell tons of electrical components like switches, breakers, cables.
Right, the DIY stores and hypermarkets.
Exactly. Whereas in India at that time, distribution was still dominated by thousands of smaller independent electrical shops. Sylvania's network gave Havells instant access to those big European retail channels that would have taken them years, maybe decades, and millions upon millions of dollars to build themselves from scratch.
So Havells MCBs, or switches, could suddenly appear on shelves in major European chains riding Sylvania's coattails.
That was the vision. It wasn't just about selling more Sylvania lamps. It was about leveraging that entire infrastructure, the warehouses, the sales teams, the relationships with retailers to pull Havells' own product range into those lucrative developed markets.
Yeah.
It was a way to leapfrog years of organic, slow, expensive market entry. Plus, you have potential for cross-selling, shared logistics, maybe even sharing market insights.
That makes total sense strategically, a potential masterstroke for market access.
Wow.
But let's be real about the scale. The source says, evaluating a deal twice your size. You mentioned it was actually closer to 3 times their size by revenue.
Yeah.
What was the stark financial reality, and how on earth did they think they could finance this?
The financial reality was incredibly daunting. Yes, closer to 3 times their revenue. The deal price was expected to be over $200 million. For Havells, with projected sales of around $223 million that year, this was a colossal undertaking. Financing was labeled a significant challenge, which is probably an understatement.
So where would the money come from?
Their relationship with Deutsche Bank was seen as absolutely vital here. Remember, they built that connection during the Electrium bid.
Ah, the silver lining from the failed bid pays off.
Potentially, yes. And Deutsche Bank, being German, headquartered in Frankfurt just like SLI, made them a logical and likely interested partner for such a high-profile German deal. It really underscores how critical strong banking relationships are in pulling off huge international M&A, especially when you're punching way above your weight financially. You need a banker who believes in your vision.
And it wasn't just the money, right? They had internal constraints too, and that brutal timeline. How did they even manage the process?
This really highlights the human challenge. Havells, despite its success, was still run leanly. They had a small size of a senior management group and, critically, no formal mergers and acquisitions M&A personnel.
No dedicated M&A team for a $200 million plus deal?
Nope. Unlike larger corporations that would have teams of specialists for due diligence, integration planning, legal aspects, Havells didn't have that infrastructure. So the task of putting together a detailed, credible bid proposal for Rothschild within just a few days
Was immense.
immense. It meant they couldn't do weeks of duck strategic analysis or bring in armies of consultants. It was truly all hands on deck, relying entirely on their existing senior leadership to pivot incredibly fast under unbelievable pressure. It's that speed versus strategy tension playing out in real time.
Which brings us to that fascinating dynamic. Instinct versus numbers, the human element. How did Chairman QRG, the founder with that history of bold moves, react to this seemingly overwhelming opportunity? Did the numbers scare him?
QRG's reaction was apparently immediate and driven by that deep entrepreneurial instinct he'd always relied on. The sources say he was inclined to move forward with the deal right from the start.
Wow, just jumped right in mentally.
Seemingly so. He acknowledged the double-edged sword, the attraction of global expansion versus the challenge of integrating a largely European and Latin American company. But what's really striking is his attitude towards the financials.
What about them?
He apparently felt that even if the detailed due diligence later found a discrepancy of, say, $15 million or $20 million in the valuation, the difference would not matter much given the size of the acquisition.
That's incredibly bold, prioritizing the strategic leap over financial minutia.
It's a very stark example of instinct driving the decision. For QRG, the long-term strategic prize, the global brand, the market access far outweighed sweating the small stuff on the numbers. It was about the big picture opportunity.
An audacious perspective.
Yeah.
And how did Anil Gupta, his son, the joint MD with the MBA, weigh in, especially given his focus on people management as Havells' core strength?
Anil's view really captured Havells' unique philosophy and self-belief. He reportedly told the team something powerful. We are a company which goes a lot on instinct. We believe that once we enter something, we have to make it work. We believe in empowering people rather than controlling them. Yeah. What we do best is people management.
So leaning into their perceived core strength.
Absolutely. For Anil, the most important question wasn't just about the finances or the market fit. It was fundamentally human. Can we handle people?
Can we manage the integration of these different teams?
Exactly. He believed that if the answer was yes, if they felt confident in their ability to manage and motivate the Sylvania people, then they could make the whole acquisition work. He even suggested they should not, therefore, think too much about culture and other issues.
That's a remarkably confident stance on culture, trusting their management style to bridge any gap.
It speaks volumes about their internal confidence, perhaps even audacity. They genuinely seem to believe their unique, people-centric approach was strong enough and adaptable enough to overcome cultural differences and make the integration successful. It was a bet on their own organizational DNA.
An incredible bet. Okay, let's just circle back to that timeline again. Speed versus strategy. That less than a week deadline forced a rapid judgment call.
Absolutely. There was simply no time for the luxury of long, drawn-out strategic reviews, deep dives into every aspect of Sylvania's business, or multiple rounds of board debates. They had to make an incredibly fast, high-stakes decision based on the information at hand, their gut feelings, and the limited time available.
A huge risk of missing something critical.
Enormous risk. But the potential reward, gaining a global brand and network practically overnight, was equally enormous. It was a high-pressure test of their agility and decisiveness.
But as we discussed, they weren't entirely cold coming into this type of high-pressure situation, were they? The Electrium bid, even though it failed, provided some crucial training.
Precisely. Anil himself noted that the Electrium experience, despite the shock of losing, had paradoxically been the perfect preparation. He called it that massive exercise that taught them how to negotiate an international deal and build relationships with bankers under intense pressure.
So they'd been through the fire drill before.
They'd had to mobilize funding quickly, do rapid assessments, deal with top international banks. That prior experience, even though it cost them time and money and ended in disappointment, was invaluable. When the Sylvania call came, they weren't starting from zero. They knew the basic process, understood the urgency, and, crucially, had those pre-existing banking relationships ready to go.
The pain of the previous loss actually built capacity for this bigger win.
In a way, yes. It ironically forged the tools and resilience they needed for this much larger, much faster, much higher stakes opportunity.
This intense pressure and speed brings us squarely to that challenge of cultural integration. QRG, despite his bullish instinct, did flag this as a potential difficulty, didn't he? He saw the human element as a hurdle.
He absolutely did. It shows his pragmatism alongside his boldness. He recognized that while the geography and market access were attractive, actually integrating a workforce of predominantly European executives with the Indian team would be a demanding task.
And that's putting it mildly. Probably.
Probably, yeah. Think about the potential differences: work styles, communication norms, direct versus indirect, views on hierarchy, how decisions get made, consensus versus top-down, even things like work-life balance expectations or attitudes towards risk.
Huge potential for clashes and misunderstanding.
Massive. Bridging those deep-seated cultural norms between a dynamic, family-influenced Indian company and a large, established, perhaps more structured European corporate culture, that's far more complex than just merging balance sheets or product catalogs. You're merging mindsets.
And this is exactly where Anil Gupta's profound confidence in their people management philosophy comes back as the proposed solution, isn't it? Betting that their way could overcome these divides.
Yes, that belief was central to their willingness to proceed. Anil's statements about empowering people rather than controlling them, and the conviction that what we do best is people management, this wasn't just talk. It reflected a deep-seated belief in their organizational ability to bring people together, motivate them, make them feel valued, regardless of their background.
They thought their model was exportable, adaptable.
They seemed to. They'd had success integrating different company cultures within India. Now they were making a huge bet that the same people-first approach, building trust, maybe decentralizing decision-making where possible, focusing on individual contribution, would be effective in integrating European and Latin American teams.
Which directly addresses that question. Can you truly globalize without losing your roots?
Exactly. Their answer seemed to be yes, because their roots, their unique approach to managing people were, in their view, strong and adaptable enough to handle globalization. They believed their core essence was the key to successful integration, not a barrier to it. It was a strategy built on incredible self-belief in their human leadership capability.
So we've really taken a deep dive into Havells India's incredibly audacious pursuit of Sylvania Lighting International. We've traced Havells' amazing journey from that tiny trading shop in Delhi's Bhagirath Place to a company seriously considering acquiring a global giant.
And we've seen how that almost impossible deadline forced a decision that somehow had to balance this grand strategic vision with pure, raw, entrepreneurial gut instinct.
We've also explored the equally fascinating, complex journey of Sylvania itself, from its really innovative start recycling bulbs over a century ago to becoming a global lighting leader, then facing the trauma of bankruptcy.
And finally, finding itself the target for this ambitious, fast-moving Indian company. It really highlights just how dynamic and sometimes brutal global business can be.
And you know, what Havells faced back then is really a powerful microcosm of so many high-stakes decisions we all might encounter, maybe in our professional lives, maybe even personal.
That's true. When do you trust your gut feeling, that inner instinct, versus relying solely on the cold, hard numbers, the detailed analysis? How do you prepare yourself mentally and operationally for a challenge that just seems, on paper at least, way beyond your current capabilities?
And perhaps the deepest question that emerges from this story: as companies, or even as individuals, chase growth, chase global reach, how do you make absolutely sure you don't lose the very essence of what made you successful in the first place?
Your unique culture, your fundamental approach to people, your core values, your roots. Can you expand without diluting what makes you, you?
Havells, this Indian company deeply rooted in its specific culture of people management and instinct, made a conscious choice. They chose to tackle the huge cultural differences of integrating a mainly European management team by betting heavily on their unique human capital skills.
Which leaves us with a really interesting, provocative thought to consider. In today's truly globalized, interconnected world, Maybe a company's ultimate competitive advantage isn't just its financial strength or its market share. Maybe it's actually its ability to successfully integrate diverse human capital, to genuinely blend different cultures, different mindsets, and motivate them towards a common goal. Is that human integration capability the real differentiator now?
Something to definitely mull over. A fascinating question to end on. We'll explore more in our next deep dive.